Hello and welcome to the Turning Points of History. In this particular installment, we will be looking at the Yalta and Potsdam conferences. If you've heard of them, you know they're definitely important. Go ahead and take a deep dive. If you've never heard of them before, well, be prepared. These two particular meetings shaped the entire world that we live in today, hence their definition as turning points of history. A turning point is a specific, significant moment when something begins to change. A fork in the road, if you will. So, we have talked about this before. An example of a turning point could be Rosa Parks' famous bus protest as a turning point in the civil rights movement. Looking back at historical events, it can sometimes be fairly easy to mark various turning points. However, they're not always so clear until after the fact. But generally speaking, this is the moment at which a certain idea, policy, or technology comes to influence the world. And this certainly fits that criteria. So some background knowledge. This is indeed in the background of the Cold War, which began as World War II concluded. So this was a political rivalry between the so-called East and the West. This was referring to East and West of Europe, so a very Eurocentric way of looking at the world, but anyway. But principally, it became a rivalry between the United States of America and the Soviet Union. Now, Americans and Soviets were terrified of each other. Both thought their way was the right way, and they were suspicious that the other was trying to dominate the world with their ideology, as well as undermine the ideology of their own. So, what ideology is that? Well, essentially, it goes down to this: American capitalism and Soviet communism. Now, I use those terms specifically because the way capitalism is understood in, say, Sweden, or even in Britain or the Netherlands, is slightly different to how capitalism is understood in the United States. And in fact, communism in the Soviet Union would be very different to communism in, say, China, for example. So this is their own brands of these ideologies, if you will. But American capitalism goes like this: you can make as much money as you want. You should be free to make as much money as you want. There are no limits on the amount of money that you can make. All factories, all property are privately owned by individuals or, of course, companies. The state or the government should stay out of things, get out of the way, interfere as little as possible. We don't need all this government oversight. The market will sort it out. At elections, obviously, people are allowed to choose anyone they want for government, so a democracy. And the press should be able to criticize the government. They should be able to speak out against the government, also known as free speech. And the government should have no role in religion. Now, the irony of those last two statements is not lost on me, and I hope it resonates with you as well, in terms of in America, whether or not they have a free press that is allowed to criticize the government all the time. That's up to interpretation. And whether or not the government is involved with religion, also up to interpretation. Anyway, moving on. On the other side of the equation, we have Soviet communism. Now, there they believed that rich people are wicked. They are selfish. All they care about is protecting their money. They will use their vast resources and influence to corrupt the system to keep themselves rich. They should share with others. You cannot be too greedy. All factories, all property should be owned by the state on behalf of the people. So they own all property. They decide how it should be shared out, who gets to live where. A communist government should be involved in every aspect of life, because only the government, which is there to help the people, can be fair. Companies are driven by profit. If you allow companies to decide, they will simply decide what is best to make money. And that will often, or the idea was, that would often lead to mistreatment or ill treatment of citizens. Whereas the government is only interested in helping people, so they should decide everything. Okay. At elections, they should only be allowed to choose communists for government. You can't elect capitalists. You can choose anyone you want as long as they're a communist. The press is not allowed to criticize a communist government. Now, again, this is not a communist ideology. This is a Soviet communist ideology. Communism itself does not say there should be no free speech. Religious belief is all nonsense and should be wiped out by the government. The only thing you should be loyal to is your nation, is your own other citizens, and your government and your officials. You should not have any split loyalty to your religion. Again, that is a Soviet communism brand. That's not necessarily the idea of communism overall. So, how does this play out? As we know, they thought they are trying to dominate the world with their ideology. Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Britain during World War II, gave lots of warnings about the danger of Stalin and having him occupy countries in Europe and setting up communist governments there. That was a fear that Winston Churchill had. The West, that is to say France, Britain, America, thought that Stalin was trying to strengthen his position in Europe by taking over as much of Germany as possible and therefore spreading the influence of communism. Whereas the USSR claimed Stalin is only trying to protect his citizens from any more invasions, trying to put in a buffer zone, if you will. So making sure that in between any of the so-called enemy states of the USSR, there are these friendly states that are very, very kind to the USSR. So that was the idea, because the USSR had been invaded by Germany and therefore was trying to avoid any such further invasions of their nation. That was the argument they were making. So, the Yalta Conference. Well, what is going on at the Yalta Conference is World War II is starting to come to an end. So, the big three, the leaders of the three most powerful nations, decide we'd better get together and decide what we're going to do, how we're going to end this war, and what we're going to do when this war ends to try and prevent further conflicts, to bring about the best kind of peace. So, our big three. We have Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Britain. He wants free elections and democratic governments in Eastern Europe, in fact, across all of Europe, but particularly in Eastern Europe. Then we have our gentleman here, Joseph Stalin, who is more commonly known simply as Stalin, just one name. He is the leader of the USSR, technically sort of like a dictator, but he's the leader of the USSR. What he wants is more Soviet influence in Eastern Europe. He wants friendly states to the Soviet Union, so he wants to pick or help pick the politicians that will run those particular nations to make sure they are friendly to him. And then, of course, we have this gentleman, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR. He was president of the USA for the start of 1945, and he was there at the Yalta Conference. Now, what he wants, mainly, is Soviet support in the war against Japan. Keep in mind, World War II is raging on. From Churchill's standpoint, the biggest threat is Germany. Now, Roosevelt still sees Germany as a threat, but he's also quite chiefly concerned with Japan's influence and how much power they would have in the Pacific Ocean. So, here's where they decide to meet. This place called Yalta in the Black Sea. It was, at the time, and still is, part of the Ukraine. So these are our big three there. We've got Winston Churchill, we've got Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and Joseph Stalin. Now, they seem to be getting along quite well in this image. Now, again, you can't take necessarily everything from just one photograph, but in this image, it looks like they are somewhat friendly towards each other. Now, it was quite clear by the start of 1945 that Germany was going to be defeated. So this is where they decided to meet to decide the future of Europe. So these three nations are going to decide what the world looks like. Now then, at this conference, this is in February 1945, the war against Germany would not come to an end until May 1945, and there is another video about that if you wish to look into it in terms of how World War II actually came to an end and what day, and the specifics of that particular ending of the war in May and why it is somewhat controversial all stems out of this particular conference as well. So it's just before the end of the war, And these are the outcomes they sort of agreed on. So Churchill, Stalin, Roosevelt, they're all sitting around with their delegations, with their foreign ministers, with all their researchers and staff. And this is what they agree on. Germany is going to be divided into 4 zones, one controlled by Britain, one controlled by France, one controlled by the USA, and one by the USSR. And not only that, but Berlin, even though it is going to be in the Soviet-controlled zone, that would also be divided into 4 parts, controlled by Britain, France, USA, and USSR. The reason being, the idea was that Berlin was the heart of Germany. Anyone who controls Berlin has control of the entire nation. So rather than have it that any one of these nations, whether it be Britain, France, USA, or USSR, having full control of Germany by controlling Berlin, Berlin itself was also divided up. All war criminals are to be hunted down and tried for their crimes. So they're going to have trials. They're going to make the Nazis accountable. There is going to be free elections to be held in the states of Eastern Europe once they had been freed from German control. This was a big, big, big one. Stalin was totally against this. He does not want free elections because they might accidentally not choose communists. But he was persuaded to agree to this. He also agreed that I will enter the war against Japan. They had a non-aggression treaty at the time. I will help you guys out with your war against Japan as long as I am given some sort of territory or land in the Far East, which was in fact lost in a war against Japan in 1905. Again, there's another video on that if you want to take the deep dive. So the United Nations is going to be set up to replace the failed League of Nations in order to try and keep peace and avoid another war. And Germany needs to pay reparations. They need to pay for the war. They need to be punished. So this is what they all agreed on at the Yalta conference. Now, there's a few there that some people were happy with and some people weren't. But as the old saying goes, a good agreement is one in which neither party is happy. So this leads us to a second conference because the leaders of the world came together before the end of the war. They also thought, you know what, maybe we should come together and talk about this after the war. So this is taking place after May, in fact, in July of 1945, and a few things have changed. For example, Clement Attlee is now the Prime Minister of Britain. There is no more Winston Churchill. He was voted out of office. Stalin is, of course, still there. No one votes Stalin out of office because there are no elections in the USSR. Harry Truman is now the President of the United States. So 2 of our big 3 have changed. So all of these agreements that they came together at Yalta, 2 of our leaders from Yalta are gone. So this Potsdam conference was just to sort of confirm what was agreed on at Yalta and sort of work out a few different specifics. But it changes a lot. So this is July 1945. So it's just 5 months after they've had this Yalta conference. And in Potsdam, the big difference is Germany has lost. They have surrendered, okay? So lots and lots has changed. 1, President Roosevelt, FDR, had died in April of 1945 and replaced by Harry S. Truman, who was a staunch capitalist, shall we say. He was very anti-communist. He was completely against Stalin and did not wish to negotiate. There would be no deals. Churchill was defeated in an election and replaced by Clement Attlee, the Labour leader. So this is kind of a big deal because not only have we lost Roosevelt and gotten Truman, at least they are from the same party, the same political party. So they sort of share an ideology-ish. Whereas in this case, Clement Attlee is actually from the opposition party to Winston Churchill. So he has very different views and outlooks on the world than Winston Churchill in terms of British foreign policy and what is good for Britain, but also what is good for Europe. And of course, by July of 1945, Soviet troops have actually taken all of that territory from the Germans in World War II. But then, guess what? They decided to just hang around. They are essentially occupying these Eastern European countries, and there has been no free elections. Now remember, Stalin agreed, he signed on to with Roosevelt and Churchill, that once the Germans are out of those countries will be allowed to have elections. That has not happened. The USA had successfully tested the first atomic bomb by the time of this meeting, but they had not used it in warfare. They had not dropped it on Hiroshima or Nagasaki at this point, so it was unclear how powerful this weapon actually would be when deployed in a combat situation. But it is something to keep in mind that Truman is well aware that he has a weapon that no one is going to be able to stand against. This also meant that he did not feel that he was negotiating from, well, he felt he shouldn't negotiate at all, but he certainly felt like he was negotiating from a position of strength as opposed to weakness. So the division of Germany into four and treatment of war criminals, that was all confirmed. Yes, we will still divide Germany into four. Yes, we'll still divide Berlin into four. Yes, we're still going to have the trials for Nazi war criminals. But the official alliance between the USSR and the West was over. That was not going to be continuing now that this war, in Europe at least, was over. Now, this is the big three at the Potsdam Conference. So we can see Clement Attlee, we can see Harry S. Truman, we can see Joseph Stalin. Now, this might be just part of my interpretation of what may be going on, but I believe at Yalta, when the war is going on and when the Soviets are losing resources and wishing for more Allied support, and it's not necessarily clear how the war is going to come to an end, Stalin is negotiating with Churchill and FDR. He has a lot of respect for them. By the time he gets to the Potsdam Conference, it's quite clear the Red Army has been completely and utterly victorious. It's quite clear the Allies are in no position to clear the Red Army from Eastern Europe, and this is who he is negotiating with. Clement Attlee had been elected to office 20 days earlier. So he had only been prime minister for 20 days at this point. And of course, Harry S. Truman had been president for 3 months, but was unelected. He had been the vice president, so he'd been appointed by President Roosevelt, who was elected, but the people had not voted for Harry S. Truman. And that was a big deal from Stalin's perspective, because he knew that if Harry S. Truman wants to be re-elected, he needs to be seen as popular. He doesn't have the people behind him at this point, and Stalin believes that that is a weakness that he can exploit. Because, of course, Stalin has been in power. He's been in charge in the USSR for 21 years, and he feels like he is going nowhere. So he is at the Potsdam Conference negotiating with a bunch of rookies from his standpoint. If we compare that to Yalta, against Stalin at the negotiating table is Winston Churchill, who had been Prime Minister of Britain through World War II and had been in power for 5 years, but had been a politician since 1900. So years and years of experience. Stalin respected Winston Churchill and respected his intelligence and respected his power. The US President Franklin Delano Roosevelt had been president for 12 years, since 1933. Now, that may not seem as significant as being in power for 21 years from Stalin's perspective, but this was the big thing with FDR. Technically, you're only allowed to be president for 8 years in the United States. But FDR was so popular, and with the war going on, they made a special agreement that he could serve another term. So he was absolutely had the will of the people. He absolutely was popular. He absolutely had the support of his own voters, and that meant that he was negotiating from a position of strength. And of course, we have Stalin, who had still been in power for 21 years at that point. But we can see the disposition, and we can see what is the difference. So by the time we get to Potsdam, with our two young rookies versus Stalin, Stalin believes he doesn't need to listen to them. So this is what does end up happening. We get the division of Germany, and indeed the division of Berlin as well. so West Berlin and East Berlin, with East Germany and West Germany. And this is how it sits in 1945. This is what it develops into: the Cold War in Europe, the East versus West. So the Western countries, everything west of West Germany, I suppose, ends up, oh, and of course Turkey and Greece, ends up in NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, designed to defend against the perceived threat of communism. And of course, in the East, all those countries that Stalin promised could have their free elections did not get them. And these are the nations that the Red Army was still standing in at Potsdam. And lo and behold, would you believe, with all of the Soviet soldiers in them, all the Soviet tanks sitting in those countries, they just decided to become communist all on their own. What a coincidence. Now then, in terms of who should we blame for the outcome of these conferences? Because essentially, at the Yalta conference, we were looking at a peaceful end to the war, well, as peaceful as a war can be when it comes to its conclusion. And we were looking at a period of cooperation going forward between the Soviets, the British, and the Americans. We may have seen an entirely different political situation emerge after World War II. But by Potsdam, because of the absence of Winston Churchill, because of the absence of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and because of the way the war had come to an end, where it was quite clear the Soviets got to Berlin first, the Germans technically, officially surrendered to the Soviet troops first, or did they? That's a whole nother thing. Anyway, check out a previous video. But that had changed everything. So by the end of the Potsdam conference, Stalin is trying to get whatever he can. Truman does not trust Stalin and treats him as an adversary. So there is no negotiating taking place. There is no cooperation taking place at that conference. Now, I quite like this story. This is a story that I was told. I was lucky enough to go to the palace at Potsdam, where they held the Potsdam conference. And the tour guide there took us to a room, and it was the very room in which the three leaders met in to sign the documents. And the room it seemed like an odd choice. It's relatively small, actually. But the reason for its choice, according to the tour guide, was that this room, he said, look around, what do you notice? And it has 3 entranceways to this room. Now, that is why it was chosen, because that way, the leader of Britain, Clement Attlee, could come in from one side. The leader of the United States, Harry S. Truman, come in from another door. And from the third door, Stalin could come in. Now, it was thought that they would all enter this at the same time. But here's what ends up happening. And I like this story because it sort of represents the silliness and the distrust and pettiness that developed out of the Potsdam Conference and became the Cold War. Because as they were about to walk in, all 3 leaders believed the most powerful leader is the one who comes in last. So the other 2 nations are waiting for me, because nothing can happen till I get here because I'm so important. So at the time that all 3 leaders are about to walk in at the same time, each of them thinks they have this very clever idea. I am going to wait 20 seconds, 30 seconds before I enter the room so that everyone's waiting for me. So it's time to enter the room and no one walks in. All 3 of them had the same idea, so no one walked in. So then they said, all right, let's do this. Count of 3, everyone walk in. 1, 2, 3. No one walked in because Clement Attlee was like, I'll walk in on 4. And Harry S. Truman was like, I'll walk in on 5. And Stalin, at this point, is seeing the pettiness and seeing the division. He's almost chuckling to himself, not literally, because he sees, oh, advantage Stalin. I've been in power 21 years. These children are playing childish games. I've got them. And eventually they managed to negotiate it where all 3 would come in at the same time. They said, all right, everyone, 1, 2, 3. And all of them tried to be clever again and enter on 4. But because they all chose to enter on 4, guess what? They all entered in at the same time. So that's how the Potsdam Conference began. So we can see the outcomes of it weren't necessarily going to be ideal. So who should we blame? Well, we can say, or we could make the argument that it was the USSR's fault, all of these outcomes in the start of the Cold War. And the reason for that is it was harsh in its dealings at the conferences. It refused to set up free and fair elections in Eastern Europe. That alone shows that it was trying to spread communism before its borders. It is definitely the USSR's fault, without question. End of discussion. Except I've got two more boxes to go through here. So we could also say it could be the USA's fault that a Cold War emerged, because they failed to understand the suffering of the USSR in the Second World War. Without question, the nation that lost the most financially, lost the most in industry, lost the most in terms of human lives, it cannot be argued. The USSR, the Soviet Union, lost more than any other nation in terms of their fight against the Nazis. And without question, they are the chief reason that the Germans were defeated in the manner in which they were. And they also, so that meant that the USSR felt like they were owed something. Hey, we were your key ally. We sacrificed so much. And the USA at the Potsdam Conference under Harry S. Truman was very combative. They did not want to negotiate. They did not want to show empathy or sympathy. So that could be the reason that the Cold War emerges, and that's a way we could blame the USA. We could also blame the USA because they didn't really understand the idea that the USSR was putting forward. Was they wanted this buffer zone. We want to make sure that we are left to our own devices, and we are left to our own devices safely. We want friendly nations on our borders. Now, does that mean that they were right to deny free elections? Possibly not. But perhaps from the USSR's standpoint, they thought if they didn't take that particular stance, there was no way of knowing what countries the USA and Britain would help to set up in opposition to them. So this mutual distrust is also part of the reason. And that leads us to our third box. It's actually both of them. Because there's no trust. If there is no trust, there can be no cooperation at all. You can imagine if you were working with someone and they said, yeah, absolutely, just give me all of your money first and then we'll work together. If you didn't trust that person, you're not giving them your money, and therefore no cooperation, you're not working together. If you do, maybe you'll meet that condition and then you can work together and you get your money back. Or maybe you don't. But that would be very similar to this scenario. No matter who proposed what, the other side wasn't going to trust it. So the Soviet Union says, we'll hold elections once we get this. The USA says, well, you're never going to hold the election, so we're not doing that. Or the USA says, I'll tell you what, USSR, if you take your soldiers back, we'll give you this. There's no way you're going to give me that if I move my soldiers back. There's no way. And therefore, there is absolutely no cooperation. And so there's an overreaction from both sides due to this lack of trust. The USA hates us. We must defend ourselves against this threats to our way of life would be the policy of the USSR. But that would also be the policy of the USA. Well, clearly, the USSR is trying to expand. Clearly, they're trying to dominate Europe. If they're able to dominate Europe, we don't have our alliances. We lose our trade. We lose out financially. We lose our power in the world, blah, 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 blah. We're so good. We're so awesome. We're so tough, which is sort of the attitude that USSR is trying to take as well. But the outcome really is that from Potsdam on, both sides took a more aggressive stance. So an interesting thought exercise, if you will, is to think about the world we could have had with the cooperation between the USA, USSR, and Britain, as seemed to be the case at Yalta, versus the world we got, where there's a split between Eastern and Western Europe. There is a rivalry for absolutely decades. Even today, there is rivalry within Germany, where there's a lot of West Germans that don't like East Germans. There's a lot of East Germans that don't like West Germans. There's a lot of issues to do with Poland in terms of we were communists for so long, we hate the communists, and this pushback against that to become so far right. And then, of course, that leads to a rise in, we should go back to when we were communists and we were so successful. We see absolute fears in a lot of countries along the Baltic in Eastern Europe that are afraid that Russia is trying to reunite the Soviet Union and get back to when they were strong. A lot of the political issues that exist in the world today are because of the Cold War. And the Cold War is very, 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 very much because of the Yalta, the potential success of the Yalta conference, and the eventual failure of the Potsdam Conference, which is why we can specifically say this is a major turning point in history. So I hope you have learned something from this particular video. And if you can, go back and take a look at previous videos that were referenced in this particular installment. I'll see you next time.